do you agree with this theory? You don't have to fight them where they want the fight. Fight them where they would not like the fight. They already have so many troubles in the South China Sea. Join a countervailing strategic alliance against Beijing. Hit them where it hurts most.
I mean, in theory, that's attractive, except for the risk of escalation, and you also need willing partners at this point in the midst of the pandemic. I think will be difficult to find. I think the immediate goal needs to be a restoration of the status quo ante, and that can only be done through political diplomatic channels. I also think that in the long run, this will probably have a short-term impact on India-China relations, but the reality is that their neighbors and their economies are the two largest in Asia, so they can't avoid each other. But I think India will have to, face some hard choices in its long-term alignment portfolio. I don't expect radical changes to that alignment portfolio, but I do expect at least some thinking about.
No, so you've cited what problems there are in the South China Sea option. Could you also suggest what should be done in which case?
I mean, the only possible option, I think, is to confront the Chinese at the points of pressure with deterrent force posture that compels them effectively to withdraw to the status quo ante. You could attempt to open up other fronts along the line of actual control, but that does risk escalation. I mean, at some point, this needs to be solved by the two leaders at the top rather than having a bottom-up solution in ways that don't risk escalation.
You almost seem to be apprehensive of escalation, but Sushant Sareen, what is the greater risk of escalation than having the Indian and the Chinese armies arrayed opposite each other on Finger 4? If you've got as much deployment as you do, any second there can be breaking news coming in suggesting that there has been massive escalation. How do you, from an Indian national security perspective, look at India's options? Sushant.
I think we have very limited options. The options which Nitin was suggesting perhaps are very long term, and perhaps you can only do those if you are doing it in conjunction with other countries. But let us also not forget that the Chinese Navy is no spring chicken, and that does not solve our problem, our immediate crisis in the Himalayas. Now, I think the more we talk about trying to avoid escalation, and this is a trap in some ways, and you really need to delicately traverse this trap. But the more you talk that you really want to avoid escalation, you don't want to get into any kind of a confrontation with the Chinese, I think the more it emboldens the Chinese that they can push you a bit everywhere. So I think you have to be ready for escalation. If it means that, yes, it leads to some kind of a conflict, you have to be prepared for it. Because until and unless you're going to be able to do that, I think...
So you track the Indian Army very closely. Do you think we're ready for escalation and for conflict?
Look, if you're not ready for it, then you will have to simply give in and accept the terms which the Chinese are offering you. Are you ready to do that? I don't know how politically, strategically, militarily that's a feasible option. It's better to have a scrap, get a bloody nose yourself, give the other guy a bloody nose. It'll be very expensive, it'll be very horrific, but maybe that has a far better option than to simply lay over and play dead. The other thing is, and where I disagree with what Vipin is saying, I think despite all this talk about neighbors and all, we have another neighbor on our western front. How much have we managed to do with them? So I think this is going to cause some serious long-term and medium-term damage with the Chinese. And I don't see how the Indians are simply, after a couple of months going to go back and say, okay, fine, we'll continue to do business with the Chinese the way we were doing. I think that rethink is not just coming in India when it comes to global supply chains and all of that. I think every country has realized their vulnerabilities, their economic vulnerabilities and their strategic vulnerabilities of depending on the Chinese for as much of their manufacturing as they started doing. And that is why I think a lot of that shift is also going to take place.
Jeff Smith, so, will this lead to a permanent pivot
from that shift which is going to take place? So yes, I think it's going to cause long-term damage, but I think in the short term you don't have any choice but to confront the Chinese. That does not mean firing first, but it also does not mean backing down.
Jeff Smith, will this lead to a permanent pivot towards confrontation, or is this just a temporary hump, a temporary setback, and we'll get over it because ultimately this is about 1/3 of humanity, and can 1/3 of humanity be in permanent confrontation with each other?
Well, I think, China is India's neighbor, and you're not moving from geography. So there has to be some form of continued engagement with China, but as we can see from the U.S., China is still our largest trading partner, but the relationship has become much, much more competitive in recent years. Rivalry has come to the surface, and I think that's going to be the case with India. Even as they continue to trade and engage where they must, the competitive aspects of the relationship are going to come to the fore. You know, if I were sitting in Delhi, I would be hesitant amid a global pandemic and global recession to escalate militarily over territory that was not previously under my sovereign control to begin with. That would be a high bar.